So ready to dive into these articles and see what they're saying about the future of illustration and web design. They say 2025 is going to be a big year.
Yeah, big changes ahead, for sure. But from what I've been reading, it's not all about crazy new tech, although there's definitely a lot of that. It's also about, like, a return to some classic styles, but with a totally modern twist.
That's interesting. Okay, so we've got 3 articles here. And the first thing that jumps out, they all seem to be saying that AI is going to completely revolutionize the design world. Like, are we even going to need human designers anymore?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
But from what I'm seeing, it's not so much about AI replacing designers, but more about, like, giving them a whole new set of tools and superpowers.
Okay, so less robots are taking over and more robots are here to help.
Exactly. It's like, imagine this. You're working on a brand identity for a new client, right? And you need to come up with a color palette that not only looks good, but also, like, speaks to their target audience and conveys the right emotions. Instead of spending hours, like, going through color swatches and trying different combinations, you could just feed AI a few keywords about the brand.
And boom, instant color palette. Perfectly tailored to the client's needs.
Pretty much. One article even talked about AI being able to generate different illustration styles based on, like, a simple text prompt. So if you need a character for a children's book, you can tell AI to make it whimsical and fun. But if you're working on a tech company's website, you could tell AI to go for something sleek and futuristic. It's pretty wild.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
But it also makes me wonder about, the human element. Will all this AI-generated design end up feeling kind of, generic? Like, will we lose that unique, handcrafted feel?
I get what you're saying, and it's definitely a valid concern, but I think it's important to remember that design is about more than just, like, pure aesthetics. It's about solving problems, communicating ideas, creating experiences that connect with people on an emotional level. AI can definitely help us do those things more efficiently, but at the end of the day, it's still up to the human designer to provide the creative vision, the critical eye, the understanding of what makes us human.
So it's less about man versus machine and more about man with machine.
Exactly, like a partnership where each brings their own strengths to the table.
I like that. So we've got AI shaking things up, but these articles also talk a lot about diversity and representation in design, which I think is really important, especially in illustration.
Absolutely. Like, for far too long, illustration, especially in advertising and media, has often reflected a very, how do I put it, narrow view of the world, right? And it's about time we see a wider range of faces, cultures, experiences represented.
One article called it expanding the boundaries of visual storytelling, which I thought was a really powerful way to put it.
Totally. It's not just about, like, checking boxes and making sure we have a certain number of, different ethnicities represented. It's about creating images that feel authentic, relatable, and truly representative of the world we live in.
And that's not just a feel-good thing either. Like, from a purely creative standpoint, tapping into a wider range of cultural influences and perspectives is only going to lead to richer, more interesting, more engaging design.
Totally agree. It's like diversity isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do.
Love that. Okay, so we've got AI, we've got diversity. What else is on the horizon for the future of design?
Well, buckle up, because this one might surprise you. Get ready for a blast from the past, because apparently retro is back, baby.
Wait, really? Retro? Like, I thought we were all about that sleek, minimalist aesthetic these days.
We are, but, like, with a twist.
Right.
One article talked about how designers are blending these retro and psychedelic art styles, think like bold colors, groovy shapes, maybe even a touch of the surreal with, like, modern sensibilities. It's a really cool fusion of nostalgia and cutting-edge design.
So, like, taking something familiar and giving it a fresh, modern spin, I kind of dig it.
Exactly. And apparently it's a great way for brands to connect with younger audiences, like tapping into that sense of nostalgia for a time they never even experienced.
Okay, I have to admit, I'm intrigued. But how does this blend of old and new, of AI and human creativity, actually play out in something like, say, web design? Are we about to enter the era of the psychedelic website?
Maybe not psychedelic in the, like, literal sense, but definitely more immersive, more interactive, and, dare I say, more real.
Okay, now you've really got my attention. Tell me more.
So instead of just looking at a static product photo on a website, imagine being able to, like, virtually try on clothes, explore a 3D model of a car before you buy it, or even, like, take a virtual tour of a hotel room.
Whoa, hold on. Are we talking like full-on VR headsets for all of this?
Headsets are definitely part of it, but it's also about augmented reality, using our phones and tablets to kind of overlay digital elements onto the real world.
Okay. Yeah, I could see how that would make online shopping a lot more immersive. But isn't that going to be incredibly complex to design for?
Yeah.
Like, how do you even begin to design a website that works in both the real world and this, virtual world?
Right. It's a whole new ballgame. One of the articles actually called it designing for multiple realities, which I thought was kind of a cool way to put it, because you're not just designing for a flat screen anymore. You're designing for a 3D space that people can move through and interact with.
So does that mean web designers basically need to become architects now?
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about things like spatial awareness and flow and how people move through a physical environment?
Pretty much. And it's not just about the visuals either. They also have to consider how sound plays a role, how to incorporate things like, touch and maybe even smell down the line. It's wild.
It's like they're designing experiences, not just websites. But with all this talk about fancy tech and pushing the boundaries of what's possible, I also wonder about the accessibility aspect. How do we make sure these immersive experiences are inclusive for everyone, especially people with disabilities?
That's such an important point, and it's something that came up in a couple of the articles as well, because, it's easy to get caught up in all the excitement of new technology, but we can't forget about designing for everyone.
Exactly. What's the point of having a website that looks incredible in VR if someone who's visually impaired can't even access it, right?
Right. So designers are going to have to think about things like, alternative input methods like voice commands or haptic feedback, and how to make these virtual environments navigable for people who might not be able to experience them visually.
Speaking of voice commands, that was another big one that kept popping up in these articles. It seems like voice-activated everything is going to be huge.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Think about how we use things like Siri and Alexa now. We're so used to just talking to our devices, and websites are going to have to adapt to that.
So instead of clicking buttons and scrolling through menus, we're going to be talking to our computers.
Basically. Which means web designers are going to have to get really good at things like natural language processing and understanding user intent. It's not just about designing what you see on the screen anymore. It's about designing the entire conversation.
Okay, that's a pretty mind-blowing thought. But before we go too far down the rabbit hole of talking websites and virtual reality shopping sprees, I do want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, and that's the issue of sustainability. It seems like every industry is grappling with its environmental impact these days, and from what I'm reading, the design world is no exception.
Absolutely. And it's not just about using recycled paper for business cards anymore, although that's always a good thing. We're talking about a much more holistic approach to sustainability where designers are considering the environmental impact of every decision they make.
One article actually used the term eco-friendly design, which I thought was interesting. So what does that actually look like in practice?
Well, for starters, it means optimizing website code to make it as lightweight and fast-loading as possible.
Which is good for the environment and for impatient users like me.
Exactly. But it also means choosing hosting providers that use renewable energy, minimizing the amount of data that needs to be transferred, and even designing websites in a way that makes them easy to update and maintain so they don't need to be completely redesigned every couple of years.
So it's about reducing waste, both in terms of energy consumption and digital clutter.
Exactly. And that actually ties into another trend we talked about earlier. Minimalism.
Right. Because a website that's clean, streamlined, and easy to navigate is not only going to load faster, it's also going to use less energy.
Exactly. But remember, we're not talking about stark, boring websites here. It's still important to have visual interest and personality. It's just about achieving that with fewer elements, more strategic use of color, typography, imagery.
So it's about finding that balance between aesthetics, functionality, and sustainability.
You got it. It's about designing websites that are not only beautiful and easy to use, but also kind to the planet. And you know what? That actually brings us to one of my favorite trends that I wanted to touch on, and that's the idea of designing for longevity.
Longevity. You mean making websites that don't look dated in a year?
That's part of it, for sure. But it's also about building websites that can, adapt and evolve over time without needing to be completely scrapped and rebuilt every few years.
So instead of contributing to, digital waste with constant redesigns, it's more about creating a solid foundation that can be updated and refreshed, isn't it?
Exactly. Think of it like building a house, right? You want a strong foundation that can withstand the test of time, but you might want to, update the paint color, swap out the furniture, maybe add an extension down the line.
So it's like modular design, reusable components, a focus on long-term value rather than just chasing the latest trends. It's like the opposite of fast fashion, but for websites.
Now you're thinking like a designer. It's about moving beyond the ephemeral and embracing a more sustainable, mindful approach to digital creation.
Okay, I have to say, all this talk about sustainability and longevity is making me feel a lot more optimistic about the future of design. But before we wrap up, I do have to ask, with all these technological advancements and trends we've been talking about, where does that leave the human designer?
The million-dollar question. And that's precisely what we'll dig into after the break.
Okay, so back to the big question. If AI is going to be doing all this incredible stuff, designing websites in the blink of an eye, creating custom illustrations from a few words, where does that leave us humans? Are we about to be obsolete?
Right, like are we all going to be out of a job in 5 years? I don't think so. At least not if we play our cards right.
Okay, because I have to admit, I'm having a little bit of an existential crisis over here. Convince me that we're still relevant.
Okay, so one of their articles had this great analogy. It said that we should think of AI as like the new intern in the design world.
The intern. Okay, I kind of like that.
Right, because, interns are great for like taking care of the tedious, repetitive tasks, the grunt work that nobody wants to do, but they're not exactly calling the shots, are they?
True. They're there to learn and assist, not to replace the entire team.
Exactly. And that's kind of how I see AI fitting into the design world. It can handle a lot of the technical heavy lifting, but it's still up to us humans to provide the creative direction, the strategic thinking, the big ideas.
So less time moving pixels around and more time brainstorming and coming up with the next big thing that's going to blow everyone's minds.
Exactly. And don't forget, design is all about connecting with people on an emotional level, understanding human needs and desires, and that's not something that AI can replicate, at least not yet.
Yeah, you can have the most technically perfect design in the world, but if it doesn't have that human touch, that, soul, it's not going to resonate with anyone.
Precisely. And that's why I think the most successful designers in the future are going to be the ones who can really embrace collaboration.
Collaboration, you mean between designers and AI?
Exactly. Learning to work with these new tools, understanding their strengths and limitations, and figuring out how to use them to enhance, not replace, our own creativity.
I like it. A human AI design dream team. But, all this talk about pushing the boundaries of design and technology and everything, it sometimes feels like we might be leaving some important things behind in the name of innovation.
Like what?
Well, accessibility, for example, and inclusivity. It's great to design a website that looks amazing in VR, but what about people who can't afford VR headsets or who have disabilities that make it difficult to use them? Are we designing for everyone or just a select few?
That's such an important point, and honestly, it's something that I think the design world is still grappling with. Because it's so easy to get caught up in the wow factor of new technology that we forget to stop and ask ourselves, wow, but for whom?
Right. A website that's not accessible to everyone might be visually stunning, but it's not really good design, is it?
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to make things like accessibility and inclusivity core principles of the design process, not just, afterthoughts or boxes to check on a list.
So thinking about things like, color contrast for visually impaired users, keyboard navigation for people with mobility issues, offering multiple language options for a global audience, making sure that everyone can access and enjoy these new experiences we're creating.
Exactly. And the best part is designing for accessibility and inclusivity. It actually makes our designs better for everyone.
It's like that saying, when you design for the margins, you design for the whole.
Yes. Beautifully said. And you know what? I think that actually ties into this whole idea of sustainability that we were talking about earlier.
Well, how so?
Because designing for accessibility, for longevity, for a diverse range of users, that's inherently more sustainable than creating something that's flashy, but ultimately exclusive and quickly becomes obsolete.
It's about thinking long-term, not just about the latest trends or the coolest new tech.
Yeah.
It's about creating designs that have a positive impact on people and the planet, both now and in the future.
Yes, 100%.
Okay, so if we had to leave our listeners with just one takeaway from this whole conversation, what would it be?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think I would say, be bold, be curious, and never stop learning. The future of design is going to be full of surprises, but if we approach it with a spirit of collaboration and a commitment to creating a more inclusive and sustainable world, I think the possibilities are truly endless.
I love that. The future of design is what we make it. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been an eye-opening conversation. Until next time.